Thank you very much, and thank you for those very kind and generous words of introduction. Yes, this is actually the title of my talk. I have changed it a little. It's Why Anti-Corruption Policies Fail, Systemic Corruption as a Collective Action Program. And as was said, this comes from an operation I started with my colleague Søren Holmberg in 2004. We got a minor grant to build a database. Since corruption and issues about quality of government can be a little politically sensitive, I would like to underline that we are an independent academic research institute. We do not take political orders from anyone. We think that we are, as the famous American political scientist Aaron Wildavsky once says, our ambition is to speak truth to power. We are basically political scientists, but we have lots of interdisciplinary communication and interaction with anthropologists, economists, historians, psychologists, sociologists, and so forth. We got major funding in 2007, and then again 2009, and just recently this year we got a so-called advanced research grant from the European Research Council. So we have many problems, but none of them spells money, which is nice. It's a quite large operation for the social sciences. It's about 30 researchers just now, and as we speak, we are recruiting 7 new ones. The aim here that we have is to carry out and promote research about the importance of trustworthy, reliable, competent, non-corrupt, non-discriminatory government institutions. That is loosely how we define quality of government. And here you can see one thing. We think that quality of government is something different than quality of democracy. Quality of democracy is one thing, and quality of government is another thing. And another central focus is that since, as you may know, most political scientists are interested in explaining politics, who wins elections and who becomes president and why are voters voting like they do. We are not interested in this. Our main dependent variable, what we want to explain, is human well-being, is what the machine can do for real people, not the machine itself. And this differentiates us from many of our colleagues. I should also mention a few words about a project that we are the main organizing partner in. It's called ANTICORRP, Anti-Corruption Policies Revisited, Global Trends and European Responses to the Challenges of Corruption. This is a so-called large-scale integrative project funded by the European Union's 7th Framework Program. It started in 2012 and it will last for 60 months. It involves no less than 21 research groups in 16 EU countries. It's about 70 researchers and it has a budget of about 10 million euros. This is actually the largest European Union funded research project in the social sciences so far. And it has a little different background than the Quality of Government Institute. Here it's more policy oriented. It is to investigate the factors that promotes or hinder effective anti-corruption policies. It's more interdisciplinary, so we have people from all over the place. And the background is like this, that until the mid-1990s, corruption was basically, and bad governance was basically a non-issue in the social sciences. There were no teaching, hardly any research, and no data. And one reason for this was that the area was dominated by a theory from economics saying that, yes, some corruption is probably bad for society, but some corruption is probably good because it greases the wheels. And these two things even out, and since there were no data, there were no research. Honestly, I and my generation of social science professors in my part of the world, we went through our whole undergraduate, graduate, and PhD training without this question ever being discussed. Never. And this whole thing changed in the mid-1990s when we got the first data from Transparency International and when people started to do empirical work. And it also changed because you can say the Nobel Prize to the economic historian Douglas North, who underlined the importance of good institutions for economic development and social development. So since then we have had a quite big change. Institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Foundation, the European Union, we have Transparency International, we have the United Nations who have taken a convention against corruption in 2006, which is now signed by 141 countries. So we now have what you can say a big international anti-corruption regime that is really trying its best to handle this problem. Since we can now see that the detrimental effects of corruption on many central aspects of human well-being, they are well known. However, this is the problem. Knowledge about corruption is there, but how it can actually be fought is much, much less developed. And as it can be measured, these 15 years of anti-corruption policies, the results on the ground are basically zero. Some countries have improved, but many more countries have actually higher corruption than it was. This is difficult to measure, but I would say that this is a clear sign that so far the anti-corruption policies that have been launched by all those organizations have not delivered. And this is the background for this huge project. We try to understand what is wrong with these anti-corruption policies. Why doesn't it work? Let me just briefly say something about the resources we have. We have the two largest databases with everything you can think about that relates to this problem. I should also say that they are now very easy to use. Anyone that can order an airplane ticket on his computer or her computer can now use it. You don't have to be a data wizard. You can go in and see if corruption increases in China by X%, what will happen with, say, infant mortality. You can create all things. All of our data is in the public domain, I should say that. The very day we have access to the data, everyone else has access to the data. We have also carried out the two largest surveys so far related to quality of government. In 2010, we carried out a survey of 34,000 people in 25 European countries, including Spain, with detailed questions about their both perceptions and experiences of quality of government. We did a new round of this survey this winter, a year ago, where we sampled 84,000 people. We included also Ukraine, Turkey, Finland, and we doubled the number. And the nice thing with this survey, I will speak more about it later, is that the samples are based on regions, not countries. So we can see if there are regional variations within countries. We have also this expert survey. We have now actually interviewed experts, basically professors in public law and public administration, in now 140 countries. We have 1,200 experts here where we can analyze. And of course there are working papers, articles, books, and so on. Everything here is public and can be used by scholars, and is used by scholars all around the world. You can just Google COG here. We have bribed Google, so if you Google COG, we will be the first thing that comes up. Yeah, this talk is based on 3 books and a number of articles. This is the book I published in 2011. Last year we published an edited volume Good Government, the Relevance of Political Science. This is now actually out in paperback, so it's not ridiculously expensive anymore. And this summer we published the first report about corruption in Europe about this regional survey. This is actually a Spanish colleague of mine, Victor Lapuente, and this is an American colleague, and we work together at the Quality of Government Institute. It's also based on a number of articles together with colleagues that are under publication or just published. Why anti-corruption reforms fail, systemic corruption as a collective action problem, governing religion, the long-term effects of secret financing. It's My Money, Why Big Government May Be Good Government is forthcoming, and then an article together with an anthropologist, Bribery in Pre-Industrial Societies, Understanding the Universalist Particularist Puzzle. Why are we thinking that effective anti-corruption policies are important? Well, for the following reason. We live in a world now where we see a phenomenally success of democratization. I don't have to remind you that when I was a teenager, not only Spain, but Portugal and Greece were bloody dictatorships. Then you democratized, and South America started to democratize. Eastern Europe came in the 1990s. Many countries in Africa are now democracies, and actually we have now democracy in countries where you couldn't believe 10, 15 years ago, Indonesia, Taiwan. So this is, of course, a fantastic time. Democracy is a huge, phenomenal success. We should all be very happy. However, now come the bad news, and they are quite troubling. The effect of democracy, our best measure of the level of democracy in countries, do not correlate well with our measures of human well-being. This is the major problem, I think, that democracy is not delivering increased human well-being. I will just show you some very simple bivariate scatter plots, diagrams from our database. So this is the level of democracy, our best measure we have on this. And this is my favorite measure of human well-being. It's not how many years you live. It doesn't really so nice to live until you're 90, but you're desperately ill the last 30 years. But this is healthy life years, how many years you can think that you will live a healthy life. And as you can see, democracy doesn't give you anything. The correlation is nothing. There is countries that are very good democracies with very low healthy life years, and there are countries that are very undemocratic where people live a long and healthy life. So democracy doesn't give you anything here. Now change to control of corruption and bang, here you get something. If you can lower corruption, you will actually improve healthy life years. Now you have the famous Human Development Index created by the United Nations Development Program. And again, you can see that the correlation with level of democracy is really not impressive. Now, change to control of corruption. Again, it doubles. Here you get something. If you can lower corruption, Human Development Index will increase. This is a nice measure. This is if people are happy, life satisfaction. We are a partner in the World Value Survey, where people are asked all over the world in surveys if they are satisfied with their life. Do you get more satisfied if you live in a democracy? Really not much. Again, change to control of corruption, and it goes up. Actually, when you do the big, more complicated statistical regression analysis, where you control for a number of factors, there seem to be two reasons why people are not happy with their life. One is if they perceive that they are ill. The other one is if they perceive that they live under discriminatory, unfair, or corrupt government institutions. Most other things just go away. They are not important. You do get happy with more money, but actually only up to a certain point. I think it's now about $24,000 per GDP per capita a year. Then it fades away. Above that, money doesn't make you more happy, as it can be measured here. This is a fun thing inspired by Daniel Kaufman, former head chief economist at the World Bank, who is arguing that corruption has a detrimental effect on countries' possibility to control their budget deficits. So here we have this famous ranking agency, Standard & Poor. This is their foreign credit ranking, basically ranking how well the country is handling its public finances. And here again we have level of democracy. And again, you see, democracies are not better than autocracies in handling their public finances. But take a look, if we change to control of corruption, bang, again we get a huge effect. And lastly, of course, people are interested in money. This is GDP per capita, this is level of democracy. Are you richer in a democracy? Yes, sometimes, but there are some very undemocratic countries where people are very rich. So democracy actually doesn't correlate with if you are wealthy, but take a look at this. If you can get low corruption, this is a quite high figure. Here you have a clear correlation. Now let me make one thing very clear. This is not an argument, absolutely not, against democracy. I will be the last person on this earth arguing against democracy. What I'm saying is that democracy is not enough. If you want to create human well-being, democracy must also come with high-quality government. Otherwise, democracy will not deliver. You can also compare countries if you don't like statistics. The very well-known Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, philosopher and economist, 2 years ago published an article where he compared quality of life China versus India. And as many of you know, he is of Indian descent and has always hailed the Indian democracy. But he now has to confront the fact, and I think this is very troubling, that autocratic communist China outperforms liberal democratic India on every conceivable measure of human well-being. Take anything and you will see this. And this is of course quite troubling for all of us who are hoping that democracy will deliver. Now, some of you may say, the point of democracy is actually not to deliver human well-being, is to create political legitimacy. We will accept those rules because we have elected them. So will democracy deliver political legitimacy? Well, it has for a long time been taken that democratic rights is what gives you political legitimacy. This is a quote from a very well carried out survey by an American political scientist, Bruce Gilley. He says, general governments, a composite of the rule of law, control of corruption, and government effectiveness, clearly has a large, even overarching importance in global citizens' evaluation of the legitimacy of states. It is notable that democratic rights, while certainly qualifying as one of the most important causes of legitimacy, turn out to be roughly on par with welfare gains, and both of these are far less important than good governance. So when people, and this is another study by a Norwegian colleague, he said it is quality of government and the impartial treatment at the output side of the political system, and not electoral democracy, that creates regime legitimacy. So it's not only human well-being, it's actually also political legitimacy that comes with quality of government. Many people think that this is a problem only for developing countries. We disagree. We have two leading American economists who are explaining the crash of Wall Street in 2008 in terms of corruption, not only Danny Kaufman, but also Simon Johnson at the World Bank. Kaufman uses the word legal corruption, and he says, if anybody thought that the governance and corruption challenge was a monopoly of the developing world, that notion has been completely disposed. We have the euro crisis, well known here since 2011. And this is a quote from the former Prime Minister of Greece, saying that the problem that has hit Greece has nothing to do with the international financial market. The root cause of our problem is our internal corruption. So this is the problem. Quality of government, all standard measures of human well-being, COG measures, clearly outperforms measures of democracy. It's not only the developing or communist, former communist world. I would say, having studied this for 10 years, if you would now think what is causing human misery in the world, while people don't have access to safe water, why women die when they give birth, why people die premature, why they are unhappy, it has nothing to do with that we have not invented new medicines or technical devices. It can mostly be explained by the fact that the majority of the world's population live under dysfunctional, unfair, or corrupt government institutions. So you have an increased interest, the institutional revolution in the social sciences with people like Douglas North, Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, also March and Olson. You have more data since 1996. You have a collapse of what you can say the neoliberal Washington consensus. And we have two failed hopes here. The first hope was let the market rule. This was the Washington consensus. Yes, deregulate, privatize, and so on, and things would go well. This is one of my favorite development economists, Daniel Roderick at Harvard. He says, the encounter between neoclassical economics and the developing society served to reveal the institutional underpinnings of market economies. A clearly delineated system of property rights, a regulatory apparatus curbing the worst forms of fraud, anti-competitive behavior and moral hazard, a moderately cohesive society exhibiting social trust and cooperation, social and political institutions that mitigate risk and manage social conflicts, the rule of law and clean government. And then it comes. These are social arrangements that economies usually take for granted, but which are conspicuous by their absence in poor countries. And as you can see, this is a long list of high-quality institutions that we are at. The second failed hope has, of course, been democracy. This is a quote from one of the leading political scientists in democratization research, Larry Diamond. He is head of the National Endowment for Democracy that exists in the United States. And this is what he said in 2007 when they celebrated their 25th anniversary. He said, there is a specter hunting democracy in the world today. It's bad governance, governance that is drenched in corruption, patronage, favoritism, and abuse of power, where power confers virtually unchecked opportunities for personal, factional, and party enrichment. It is difficult, if not impossible, to sustain democratic rules of the game. The democratic spirit of election drowns in vote buying, rigging, violence, or all three. So these are the two failed hopes, I think. Both let the market loose or just go for democracy. None of these will work if you do not have high enough quality institutions in the place. Now, if this is important, you need to know what it is. And I spent a lot of time in this definitional area. So when you define, and this is not so unusual. I mean, think about the endless discussion of how to define democracy or power or opportunity. So you have to make a number of choices here. Should the definition of quality of government be normative or empirical? I think it has to be normative. You cannot speak of quality or good if you don't enter a normative discussion. Is quality of government a universal thing, or is it relativistic? Do people think about corruption differently in different parts of the world, or can we think of quality of government in the same way we think about human rights or democracy? Is it about political procedures like democracy, or should you include also types of policy here? So some types of policies should be. Should it be one thing, unidimensional, or should you have many things? And should you use the word governance or the word government? I cannot go into all of these, but I will speak about a few of them. I think there are strong arguments for a universal definition of quality of government. If we accept the relativistic understanding of things like democracy, our friends in China will say we are also democratic, we just have a little different ideas from you what it means. If we would accept a relativistic definition of gender equality, our friends in Saudi Arabia would say we also have gender equality. We all, just by chance that women are not allowed to drive cars or own property, but or our friends in Syria would say we also respect human rights, we just have a little different understanding of what it is. I think this is not good. I think a liberal approach in political philosophy says no, you should not go for a relativistic idea here. And of course, since we are measurement people, if you accept the relativistic definition of this, you can forget anything about measuring, because then corruption or quality of government would be something completely different in Nigeria than in Denmark, and we could just forget any measurement ideas. And if we cannot measure, we cannot explain the variation in quality of government, and then we cannot explain this huge variation in human well-being. But another question is, how good are the empirical arguments for a relativistic definition of quality of government? You will not be able to read this. This is from the Afrobarometer. So people in Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania have been asked 3 questions. A public official decides to locate the development project in an area where his friends and supporters lives. Second question, a government official gives a job to someone from his family who does not have adequate qualifications. And third question, a government official demands a favor or an additional payment for some service that is part of his job. And as you can see, it's only a small minority, 5 to 10%, who say this is not wrong at all. It's a little more who say it's wrong but understandable. The large majority in this hopelessly corrupt setting say it's wrong and should be punished. And this is also what we find when we have done ethnographic work, interviewing people, and collaborated with anthropologists, that people in hopelessly corrupt settings actually do not have a different moral understanding of corruption than people in Denmark or Finland. Then you have the simply wrong definitions. This is famous Nobel laureate Gary Becker. He says the big problem with corruption is big government. To root out corruption, boot out big government. The source of official corruption is the same everywhere, large government with the power to dispense many goodies to different groups. Alberto Alesina, very famous economist, head of the economics department at Harvard, said it's large government increases corruption and rent seeking. And you have also Susan Rose Ackerman who says the same. This is when ideology replaced science. This is from an empirical research where they actually look at it. They say, consistently we find that the better performing governments are also larger and collect higher taxes, and that poorly performing governments, in contrast, are smaller and collect fewer taxes. But they wouldn't be economists if they wouldn't have added that this result does of course not imply that it's often or even socially desirable to expand the government of a given quality, but it tells us that identifying big government with bad government can be highly misleading. The statistics shows not a very strong, but a notable positive correlation between high levels of public spending and low corruption. It's 0.3. We're not the first to point this out. But these results have gone largely unnoticed and been ignored. And I think this is an ideological thing, that big government is bad, has been very strong. You can say many things about the countries where I come from, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, but you cannot say that they have high corruption, and especially since I pay taxes there, you cannot say that these are small governments. They are quite big. Another question is if this should be about procedures or policies. So the World Bank say good governance includes sound policies. They want to include a specific set of policies. There are philosophers who say you should include the morality of the laws. And there are problems with this. Do the experts at the World Bank or the philosophers really know what is sound policies? I'm not so sure. Do they know how to construct a good pension system? Do they know how to create financial market so it won't collapse every 10 years? I'm not convinced. And also there is another problem. If the experts at the World Bank and the philosophers knows what is sound policies or the morality of the law, why should we at all need democracy? The expert could rules. Plato was right. Let the expert rules. And the second problem is, of course, if you include policies, how can you reach an overlapping consensus? Why should the people in a country who don't like these policies accept them? And you usually define representative democracy as a set of procedures, and I think this should be the same for quality of government. It should be procedures, not policies. So what we do is that we have put all our money in this concept, impartiality. We define quality of government in the following way. When implementing laws and policies, government officials shall not take anything about a citizen or case into consideration that is not beforehand stipulated in the policy or the law. So they cannot take into consideration if you have paid them bribes, but also not things like your gender, your ethnicity, your family background, and whatever it is. This is an idea that quality of government is about the exercise of political power, not the access, not the democracy side of political power. This, as I said, rules out corruption, but also other forms of favoritism, like clientelism, nepotism, patronage, and various types of the discrimination. Now, I think this is good because a problem is, for example, with corruption, that it has been defined as the abuse of public power for private gain. That is the standard definition. The problem with this definition is what should count as abuse have never been defined. So you do not know what norm that is transgressed when corruption occurs. But if you define it as we have done with impartiality, then you know what norm is transgressed when we can say this is no longer quality of government. Can it be measured? This is, of course, a big question. The short answer is yes, of course, with some reservations. There is always measurement problems. But when I started this business, I was very afraid about the measurement problem, that the measures were bad. And I'm not so afraid anymore of this. Actually, I'm not afraid at all, for two reasons. First, we now have 6 different institutes that try to measure quality of government. The World Bank, we, Transparency International, Freedom House, and so some measure the rule of law, other government effectiveness, we measure impartiality, transparency, measure corruption. These measures correlate at the 0.9 level. So basically they are seeing the same, the experts see the same. What's even more interesting is that when you ask ordinary people in these countries in representative studies, they make the same evaluation as the experts. The correlation between the expert surveys and the ordinary people surveys is like 0.85. The problem is something else. In this regional survey we have carried out, in some countries in Europe, not all, but in some countries, there is huge regional variation. Most so in Italy, also some in Spain and Portugal, but most so in Italy. So the regions in southern Italy have a quality of government, you would say, maybe not on a Nigerian, but well on a Moroccan level. It's really bad. But the regions in northern Italy are clean as Denmark. It's a miracle. We cannot really not explain it, but there is huge variation. And that means that when you set one figure for Italy on the level of corruption, it of course seriously underestimates the corruption in southern Italy and overestimates it in northern Italy. Now, we see, when we do this, we study the police, the healthcare and education. And most of you would think that the police is the worst area. It's not, it's healthcare. You have, and education is best. So you have both regional variation and sector variation. But this is a problem of how fine-grained your measure is. It's actually not a measurement problem. It's how fine-grained you try to measure it. So this is just a map of the regional differences of quality of government in Europe, and you can see black and blue is good. The more yellow is bad, and here you can see Greece is worse. And you can see the difference here in Italy between the really bad south and the north here, who is clean as Denmark. And you can also see that there is some regional variation in Spain here, and there is regional variation also in Romania here, which is interesting. There is much more. I can talk forever about this fantastic survey, but just to give you an impression of when we measure it. Now, the big question is, of course, if this is so good to have high quality of government, how do you get it? And this is the million-dollar question. And my first line of defense is corruption research is quite young. We have been doing this for maybe 10, 15 years. And if I'm correctly informed, the criminologists have really not solved the problem of crime yet. And the cancer researchers have not broken the cancer problem yet. And the economists really don't know how to arrange the financial markets so we don't get into big problems every 10 years. So we should sort of have some patience here. But this is, if you go to the Handbook of Institutional Economics, this is one of the leading scholars, Avner Graef. This is what he says. Efficient institutions, and by this he means quality of government institutions, operate in a few advanced contemporary countries and only in recent times. We know surprisingly little, however, regarding the institutional development that led to these modern successes. I thought when we started this operation 10 years ago, I could go to my colleagues in history in countries like Denmark, Germany, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, and just ask for all the work they had done when these countries changed in the 18th and 19th century from high levels of corruption to reasonably low level of corruption. There is hardly anything. But what you can see here is that history is not efficient. There is no guarantee that the agents in history will create the institutions they need in order to prosper. We should actually expect the opposite. Now, one thing we have done, it's not only the data and the definitions, and so we have also challenged the theoretical understandings of this problem. The main theory in this area that owns the anti-corruption world, you can say, it's known as the principal agent theory. This is the dominant theory. It is based on an idea, a standard economic idea, that agents are rational utility maximizers. And so you have an honest principle and you have dishonest agents. This is the problem, they say. And the way to fix it is for the honest principle to change the incentives for the dishonest agents so it will not pay for them to go on to be dishonest. Basically, when fear of being caught is higher than the greed you get from corruption, things would go well. This is what they say. Now, this is actually not a good theory at all for two reasons. One is, if corruption was an incentive problem, we would have fixed it long ago. If there is one thing we know in this society, is how to change incentives. The second and more serious problem is that this theory builds on a phantom ghost that shouldn't be in the theory. This is the honest principle. We should expect in a systemically corrupt setting that it is the principals, the leaders of this society that earn most from corruption, so they have no incentive to change the incentives. Think about the Mugabes in the world, or the Gaddafis in the world, and their bank account in Switzerland. So this is one of the reasons why anti-corruption policies have failed. The other theory, which is not so big but quite substantial, is a very different theory. It's the public ethics theory. And here, agents are not motivated by self-interest utility maximization. They are motivated by social norms. And the problem of corruption can, they say, be fixed with enlightened education. So you send professors in public ethics and public philosophy from famous American universities to Nigeria to tell the Nigerians that corruption is bad. This is quite ridiculous. They know this by heart. Nobody has to tell people in Nigeria that corruption is bad. We have defined corruption as a social trap problem, a problem of collective action. And here, agent strategies are not thought of as self-interested utility maximization nor social norms. This is based that the strategies of most agents are based on reciprocity, meaning that what people do depends on what they think other people in their situation will do. This means that if most agents in such a setting think that most of the other agents are behaving dishonestly, they will also behave dishonestly because there is no reciprocity. So it makes very little sense to be the only doctor in a corrupt healthcare system who doesn't accept bribes. It's probably very dangerous to be the only honest policeman in a Mexican police force. It's useless to be the only one in your neighborhood who sort your garbage if no one else is doing it. People in hopelessly corrupt settings in small Indian villages say, yes, I hate corruption, but I have to pay the doctor to immunize my kids, because if I don't pay, the only thing that will happen is that my kids will suffer. So this means that corruption should be seen as a self-reinforcing equilibria, and it means if you want to change it, expectations must change. So not only will you change, but you will think that most agents in your situation will change. So this calls for what I have called a Big Bang change. It has to have very strong medicine, and this is also what we think we see when we interpret the historical changes that had happened in the Nordic countries or in Prussia, Germany, the Netherlands, and other. It's a kind of Big Bang change during a quite short period. So the medicine must be very strong. If you try to fight corruption by small incremental changes of incentives, it will fight you back and you will lose. So this means that you should understand corruption as a social trap, that everyone knows that if all the respect, the impartiality of the institutions, all will win. But if you cannot trust that almost everyone else will respect impartial institutions, these institutions will be destroyed because they are contingent on honest cooperation by almost everyone. This means that dishonest behavior may actually be rational when people do not trust that others will also be honest, and this means that efficient cooperation for establishing impartial institutions will only come about if people trust that most other people will respect them. Otherwise, you will end in a social trap situation. That is, you will end up in a state of affairs that is worse for everyone, even though everyone realizes that they would profit from impartial institutions. And you can see the trick is here, the trust thing. This is based on the idea of reciprocity, that it's only if you think that most other agents in your situation are willing to cooperate for not destroying impartial institutions that they will come about. Now, there are two approaches that have not been very successful here. I have many colleagues who have done fantastic statistical work, what differentiate corrupt societies from non-corrupt societies. So they say that when we do the statistics, we can see that the non-corrupt societies, they are small, they are ethnically homogeneous, they have a Lutheran history, they are very often islands, and they have a specific type of colonial history. Everything here is right, it's correct scientifically, but it's policy-wise useless. You cannot go to South Africa and say, please become an island, change your history to Lutheranism, you're too big and you're too ethnically heterogeneous. It's like if you go to the doctor, you have cancer, and the doctor will say, you should have had other parents. It's scientifically correct, but it's useless. The other is what you can call trivialism. I have many colleagues who say, well, in order to fight corruption, you need an honest civil service, strong leaders that fight corruption, public administration with integrity, effective ethical codes, independent courts. This is also correct, but it's completely trivial. It's basically saying in order not to have corruption, don't have corruption in the first place. Right? If you have a public administration with integrity, you don't have corruption. So the problem is to come up with policies that are not on this very structural level or trivial level. And this is very much in the beginning of the research, but what we can see is that countries that managed to get out of this problem, they created first a quite fair and very broad-based taxation system. If people don't pay taxes, they will not care about corruption because they will perceive it's not their problem. This is a very clear signal we have from developing countries. People hate corruption, but they don't care because they don't pay any taxes. Secondly, we find quite strong effect of universal broad-based education. If all kids from all straits in society gets a fair chance in the educational system, this will have an impact. A very strong effect you have from merit-based civil service. In most countries in the world, you get the position in the public administration because you belong to the right party, the right family, you have the right contacts, you're a man. If you erase this and say, from now on, you will get the position in the public service and you will be promoted based on your factual qualifications, this has a very strong impact. And we also find a quite strong impact from gender equality. We are arguing intensively, I and my colleagues, why this is so. I think that women are basically more honest than men. My feminist colleagues say that I am an essentialist. But I think it can also be thought of as a signal about impartiality. In most countries, historically and still today, women have been seriously discriminated when it comes to positions in the public sector. If you change this and say, well, we may not be able to create perfect gender equality, if ever, but from now on, we do not accept discrimination of women in the educational system or in the recruitment or promotion in the public sector. This is also a very strong signal about impartiality. Now, all these four things, I not say it's easy to done, but they can actually be done. They are not, I would say, completely trivial, but they are also not extremely structured. I think I'm running out of time, so I will end there. Thank you so much for listening.